By way of further introduction, I think it'd be appropriate for you to have the opportunity to identify those in attendance who are members of the steering committee, help plan the workshop, and working together now since they're almost a year, as a matter of fact, to help put this together. And I'd like to introduce them, and as I do, I'd appreciate it if they'd stand and be recognized so that other members in attendance can, other participants can see who they are, and perhaps you have a chance to interact with them a little bit during the workshop. Of course, I've introduced myself, Gary Allen with the Center for Chesapeake Communities, and Marina Alberti. Marina, she's here. Oh, there she is. Okay, over here on my right. Excellent. Molly Brown, NASA. Okay. Marie O'Neill. There she is. Fantastic. Over here. S.D. Rao. There he is over on the far side. Good man. And Kid Potter. There he is right in the back. So I hope all of you will take the opportunity to get a chance to meet and greet and talk to some of the steering committee members. They're not only an opportunity for you to offer some feedback, but they're the ones who will be involved in looking at the report before it's finally distributed. Let's take a look at our objectives. As we began to reflect on what this workshop should be all about, we spent a good deal of time talking about those objectives. Of course, we originally proposed some to the National Academy. They got slightly modified. We wanted to explore the role of trees within the greater urban ecosystem. We wanted to look at our current understanding of different types of ecosystem services provided by urban forestry, and we wanted to highlight, and we're going to spend a good deal of time looking at the tools available to track and quantify those services, to identify the gaps in our knowledge there, in our ability to model these services, to measure, monitor, and ultimately enhance their ability to provide services in the urban environment. And finally, we wanted to look at what kind of management strategies are out there and what challenges we face in implementing those strategies to provide for successful urban forestry programs in the future. I think many of you, let me get this to change, probably share my assumption that the frontier of ecology these days is not to be found where we see most press reports about the melting glaciers in the Arctic or what's happening in Greenland. Very few people live there. And in fact, it's not so much in the rural areas. It is where people live, work, study, move, and those areas where the immediate daily decisions that we make about the conditions of our lives and how we'll conduct them, it is those personal decisions, the impact each of us makes, that creates many of the changes we're experiencing on our planet today. And because that's the frontier, in my opinion, we note that the ecological services provided in those areas and the handicaps they're beginning to face in such significant ways, and how these opportunities for urban forestry and others provide access to nature is a critical consideration in the design of our communities and our places of employment these days in our cities. Many of you probably are intimately familiar with planning and zoning tools that are available at the local government and how they emphasize and articulate priorities for natural resource preservation. But these lands are threatened. As a matter of fact, in my experience, most open areas left in urban areas are frequently the first target for future development. And there is obviously the assumption that the highest and best use of all land is to have something built on it, so it provides for a greater and broader tax base. Seeing that, we've got to ask ourselves, if these lands are threatened in so many different ways, how can we begin to change public attitudes about the values that they provide? How can we begin to show that the services that originate there are essential to our living in human spaces? Scientific expertise is all around us, and we can see it assembled here in this room. We know the values and tools and other opportunities available to assess, monitor, and support these kinds of things. But here we want to look at what are some of the gaps, not only what we know, but what we want to know more about in the future. What is the growing edge of research in this area that will help convince critical decision makers in the broad community about the value of these services? And so we've convened here a lot of different expertise as we look at, because we're convinced that trees can make a difference in this area. They make a difference in our quality of life. They make a difference in how we feel about ourselves. And those things are so intangible. We frequently look at simply all the multiple benefits of urban forestry, and we look at it in air and water and habitat and that kind of stuff. But there is that intangible quality that lends a quality of life to our very living together in areas. But there are a number of challenges that remain, and these are the edges of research. The milieu in which trees are beginning to grow in areas is tighter and tighter. Many communities are experiencing a decline in green infrastructure. Only a few have experienced a very slight increase in the last decade or so. And new tools are beginning to evolve in this area to measure the land cover and to estimate and quantify the benefits, but they're not broadly accepted or widely used in many communities. And the regulatory environment that frames the use of those tools isn't always clear to local decision makers. And that means that the models and measures and metrics in this area are also somewhat confused. And in many models, air quality models being a good example, land cover is assumed to be static, and changes in it don't make a great deal of difference in the estimates of long-term benefits. How can we begin to modify? And by the way, should we modify those things? Because if those changes were taken into account, would they really make a difference? Particularly when we monitor change on such short increments. And these kinds of things generally have long-term consequences, much longer than regulatory changes currently are able to work with successfully. What does that mean for the management of this resource at the local urban level where people live and work? And ultimately, we're beginning to understand a little bit better about the fact that simply planting 1 million trees doesn't in the long term make a big difference. Why? Because in the urban environment, under the current life forecasts of many of those urban trees, half of them will die in less than 5 years. And all of them may be gone in the life span of less than 20. And obviously we want to look at the ecological service benefits for a longer period of time than that. So you can see that the consequence of that is a tremendous economic cost at the local level. And so the more we can describe precisely the benefits of investment in this and begin to look at how water and air and habitat and quality of life benefits add up, that same tree planted for any one of those reasons can continue to provide all those benefits if it's maintained throughout its life as it matures. So what does that mean for us? I can get this thing to change. Well, it means the success ultimately, I believe, is the engagement of decision makers, particularly at the local level, although frankly, public decision makers are a good place to begin because they control a substantial portion of our land resources in urban areas. But still the remainder, and the largest part of it in many communities, is the private landowner in those areas. So we need to engage not only the decision makers, local government officials, federal and state officials, and people who make regulatory decisions, but citizens themselves need to better understand that one of the easiest, most cost-effective and beneficial decisions they can make is to plant a tree on their own property. And how they understand those benefits and can be connected more clearly to the understanding of them to emphasize those values and make that decision is what we want to talk about in part in this thing. So we want people to think globally, but always we act locally because it's those local decisions that tend to make the difference, because ultimately it's about trying to influence the way people live their lives and the way people do business. These, we think, are the key steps to define an ecosystem services research agenda. And one of the things we want to look at is not just the benefits I've been talking here today, but you'll notice in the write-up and stuff, we've talked about things like disservices. So for trees in some areas have a bad rep, and we need to look carefully at why there are some disadvantages of doing it. As a matter of fact, in one state, they even talked about the best way to reduce accident death along the highway was to cut down the trees that line it, because people kept running into them. So we might ask ourselves, is that in fact that a good strategy? Is there research that ought to demonstrate the accident rate and the presence of street trees? Because ultimately what we're talking about is the kind of legacy we'll leave to our children and our grandchildren, and how we will enhance their future, not merely our own, with the agenda that we have. In order to accomplish that, the steering committee and the National Academy staff have spent a good deal of time trying to put together what we think is a very effective agenda in order to help raise these issues and give you a chance to not only hear some excellent presentations from people involved in cutting edge research today, but to give you a chance to come together and talk about those issues in small working groups. And we're going to work hard to try to track and monitor what goes on in those groups, because it's that interaction, not merely our presentation to you, that we're counting on for the success of this particular workshop. Now, as we've planned it, and Lori mentioned the fact that we've had a few changes along the way, there are still other changes that have occurred during that period. And so I'm going to ask Lori to come up and tell you about the last minute changes that have occurred just in the last week or so as we face this, because there are always some last minute dropouts.
Actually, yeah, just in the last 24 hours or so. As often happens in these big events, we have lost a few speakers in the last few minutes, last couple of days. We've had some personal injuries and some family emergencies and some flight cancellations, a little bit of everything. So and it was all involving today's agenda. So Stephanie Pinsetto will be, hopefully she will be calling in and joining us by phone. And the same with Mr. Saha from the CDC will be calling in. And unfortunately, John Plim from the EPA will not be able to join us. And so ST Rao will just be saying a few words about the topics that he was going to cover. So we appreciate your indulging us with this, some of the impromptu changes. And also, I just wanted to mention, as Gary said, we are hoping to have time for his breakout groups in the afternoon if we don't end up running terribly over schedule. And so that, just in case you're wondering, that's what the colored strips on most of your name tags indicate which breakout group you'll be in. So we'll, right before we do those breakouts, I'll come back and explain a little more how that's going to work. And we had held these seats in the front row for committee members, but they're not using them, so these are open. So any of you who are standing, feel free. Yeah, I'd say we could go ahead and bring it.
Those of you who see your names up here on the front table, if you don't go ahead and come up, I'd appreciate it, please. I think that's Ann. As they come up, I want to call your attention to one of the handouts that's on the table, and it lists all the workshop speakers and their background and bios. I don't consider it a good use of our time to repeat and read to you all the things that are involved here, except to say that those lines indicate the reasons why many of them were selected and why we invited them here to talk with you, because of their background and experience. In light of that, I'm very, very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for today to help kick us off. Dr. Ann Bartuska is the Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She is an ecosystem ecologist with degrees, obviously, from several universities you can see listed in the bio that she has. Perhaps one of the most interesting things, and one of the reasons we wanted to invite her, not only because of her position and background, is because she's currently the co-chair of the National Academy Roundtable on Science, Technology, and Sustainability, issues with which we think are very important to our discussion here today. Having said that, let me ask Dr. Bartuska to come up, and Ann, thank you very much.